Welcome to the Book Show, a celebration of reading and writers. I'm Joe Donahue. Kristin Hannah's new novel is set at a pivotal time in American history, the Vietnam era. The Women is an intimate portrait of a woman coming of age in a dangerous situation and an epic tale of a nation divided by war and by broken politics. Kristin Hannah tells this important but largely unknown historical story. There were women serving in Vietnam. The novel shows us the Vietnam War up close and personal through a woman's eyes, what it was like to serve in a combat hospital, and how it was to return to an angry, bitter country. Kristin Hannah is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of more than 20 novels, including The Four Winds, The Great Alone, and The Nightingale. It is a great pleasure to welcome her on the occasion of the release. Kristin Hannah, how are you?
I am great, Joe. Thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you again.
It's a delight to speak to you as well. This novel is really incredible, and you say that this is something you have wanted to write for a long time, but it wasn't for a long time that you said, okay, I have the chops to pull this off.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I first pitched an idea of writing about the Vietnam era to an editor in 1997. And I think it's because, of course, I came of age. I was a young woman during the Vietnam War, a young girl, actually. And it cast a huge shadow across my childhood and across my youth. One of my best girlfriend's father was a pilot who was shot down during the war. And in those days, we wore a silver prisoner of war bracelet that had his name on it and the date that he was lost. And the idea was that we would wear these bracelets in remembrance until the servicemen came home. And so I wore this bracelet for decades. And so his name and, his sacrifice and his service was always front and center in my mind. And then, of course, even as a girl, I saw the way the vets were treated when they came home. And so I've just wanted to write about this sort of turbulent era for a long time to understand it. But I kept thinking, both I'm not ready, I'm not a good enough writer, it's too big a topic to handle. And of course, there were years and years and years where the subtle message was very much, we don't want to hear about Vietnam. We don't want to talk about Vietnam. We want to, move on from that. And so I just waited and kept thinking about it. And it wasn't until March of 2020 when we in Seattle were in lockdown for the pandemic. I was watching the news and I was seeing how angry and divided our country was politically again. And it felt very much like, the Vietnam era, just the chaos and the turbulence and what was going on and the division. And then I was also watching our nurses and doctors who were really on the front line of this pandemic, sacrificing so much of themselves for us. And that was the moment I think it just all came together for me. It was like I don't know, like a blinding moment of, this is my moment. I want to write about the forgotten nurses who served in Vietnam.
Right. And that is a differentiation that I think is so important. It's not just about writing about Vietnam, but it's writing about the women in Vietnam. And in particular, you write about Frankie, who is a Vietnam nurse. Give us a sense of how Frankie ends up going over to Vietnam. It really comes from the family. Her brother is going to Vietnam. She goes to nursing school and realizes and thinks, and ultimately does, that she can make a difference.
Right. I mean, and Frankie is a completely fictional character, of course, but she is very much drawn from the nurses who actually went over there and served. A great many of them were like Frankie. They were young, 21 years old, just out of nursing school or just having a nursing diploma degree. And they came largely from, patriotic families who had talked about their World War II service in their families with great pride. And so in my novel, Frankie's brother goes to Annapolis and then goes to serve in Vietnam, and his parents are very proud of him. They have a a wall in the father's study that's called the Heroes Wall, where they put all the pictures of the men who have served in previous wars up and, and talk about them. And so Frankie thinks to herself, I can go make a difference. I can do my duty. I can serve. And so she does. She volunteers for the Vietnam War at 21 with almost no nursing experience, and finds that, her family is not proud of her because they really believe that it's the men who should be serving. But she goes off to do this, and of course this naive, sheltered 21-year-old lands in the middle of a war zone completely unprepared, both in nursing skills and in, life. She just isn't ready for what she's thrown into, which is, I think, probably true of everyone who served in Vietnam or in any war. Her challenge is to find herself and to become a competent nurse in the middle of all this.
I probably wouldn't know this if I hadn't, in addition to reading the book, but listened to the audio. But 48% of the novel has her in Vietnam, and 52% is when she's home. So it's in two parts, and that threw me initially because I thought, oh, so we're already home. But that is really when the story. I mean, before we get to that, actually, let's just talk about the intensity of what you're writing about, of her time in Vietnam, of being a nurse, and let us say being a very, very good nurse with this incredible group of women and working with these doctors, and what she is able to accomplish over 2 tours.
There was a couple of reasons for all of that. First of all, and probably most important to me, one of the things Frankie hears when she comes home, and has so much trouble dealing with, is this idea that nobody notices or recognizes or realizes that there were nurses in Vietnam. And I think that is something that women in the military have faced for a very long time. I wrote a book called Homefront about a female Black Hawk pilot who deployed to Iraq. It's about the idea of women in combat when women in combat is unrecognized. And so these scenes in the hospitals, in the mobile hospital in Vietnam, are very visceral, and there's a lot of horrific injuries and a lot of intensity. They're often being fired upon, or whatever's going on. And it was really because I wanted the reader to understand my opinion that this is combat, that Frankie was in combat, in Vietnam. Maybe she didn't hold a gun, but she definitely, her life was threatened sort of repeatedly. I think it's important that the nurses and all women in the military be recognized for combat service in non-traditional combat settings.
That really shows itself by the hours that you write about, the hours that she spends, that the nurses spend, where they're working all night into the day. They get an hour, and then they hear the choppers come down again, and they're back in the OR. And that's constant. And if they are out and they're taking a quote unquote break, then you hear the choppers and they're back in. And that is a constant, especially in the second tour, where she's really pretty much on the front lines.
Yeah, I mean, she is in a very difficult location where the fighting is really intense, and it happens to be, 1968, one of the most difficult years of the war. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand, because, of course, as you point out, the second half of the book, which was equally important to me, was coming home, because that was a big part of why I wrote the book as well. And what I wanted to explore is, this generation that went to serve, some of them, drawn from patriotic sense of duty, some of them being drafted, fighting this war, whether they wanted to or not, many of them. And then they came home. And unlike World War II, of course, there's no ticker tape parades, and there's no understanding and recognition of PTSD, and no attempt to help the vets who have come home. And that is even further exacerbated for women because they're further invisible because nobody even thought they were there. So Frankie comes home, struggling with PTSD from living in this war zone for 2 years, and finds that there just really is, not only is there no help for her from the VA or otherwise, but everybody just tells her over and over again, just forget about this and go on. It's done now. She really, really wants to do as she's being told. She wants to just forget about this, but she finds that, because of her PTSD, it's not easy for her.
Kristin Hannah is our guest. The name of the new novel is The Women. It is published by St. Martin's Press. There is a moment where, when she's home, she's at a 4th of July party. Some kid throws some firecrackers off at the party, and she hits the deck. And everyone kind of comes over, and she's trying to explain it, but it's difficult to explain. And I think you portray that so beautifully because it's so difficult to explain to anyone who has not experienced it, who has not been there, male or female, to know what she went through.
Well, and they didn't, now we understand what a flashback is. Now we understand, how trauma affects the psyche in so many ways. And, we are more understanding, and we do know how to help people and accept this. And, here's Frankie. She has no idea what's going on or why this is happening to her. And it's embarrassing and it's frightening. And, she sort of begins at some point to self-medicate as a way to deal with this on her own, which of course leads to, its own set of problems and issues and difficulties. But I think all of it really comes from this idea for her that she comes home and she begins to understand that she should be ashamed of her service. And, it's a difficult thing for her to sort of grapple with that idea. And, I think that's something that the whole generation of vets really had issues dealing with.
Let's get back to the self-medication part for a moment, because I don't want to lose sight of the fact that her first dealer is her mom.
I know. It was so amazing. When I was doing the research for this book, I found advertisements, like full-page advertisements in women's magazines that showed, a woman in a dress with an apron vacuuming the floor, basically saying, take a Valium and this will all be easier.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like, back in the day when the doctors were telling you to smoke because it would calm you down. They called them mother's little helpers, these drugs, and they were unaware, apparently, of, the difficulties that this could cause in your life if you used them.
And her mother is a society woman in society in Coronado, is very connected, is always at every event and every fundraiser, and very concerned about the image of the family as a whole. One of my favorite parts of the book is just seeing her come to terms with all of this and understanding. It may be later than Frankie would want. It may be later than any of us would want, but she gets there.
Yeah, I mean that was important for me in this too, because it is a time period from, the 50s to the 60s to the 70s is a time period. I mean, even taking the war aside, of remarkable change of mores, of society, of ideas of morality. Everything was just changing very, very fast. And her mother was very much of the greatest generation, who believed what she believed very strongly, and believed that women should live sort of this prescribed life where wifehood and motherhood was was the path of not only acceptance, but also of happiness. And I think, Frankie's whole life and her service in Vietnam, particularly, really challenges her parents to rethink their idea of what a woman can and should be. And these people do not change quickly.
Her father, that is a really interesting relationship that you explore, and you make him very rigid, and yet we get to see what he's going through, very much a product of the time, but also someone, and I think it's important, I don't think I'm giving anything away here, but the difference between someone who had served and is considered a patriot and a hero, and someone who is not.
Exactly, because what I really wanted to show with her father was a man who was deeply patriotic, but he had been unable to serve in World War II, and so not understanding combat and service in wartime, on the level of someone who served. And so, because had he served, had he been in combat in World War II, I felt, of course, that he would have understood Frankie on a much deeper level much sooner. And so he was able, I think, because of his lack of service, to discount her service and not really understand it for quite a while.
One thing that is consistent in the first part of the book and the second part of the book is the deep friendship that Frankie has with two friends, Barb and Ethel. And it's a friendship that starts at the beginning of the book and is there till the end of the book. One of the things that I have decided after reading this is that you would be a really fun pen pal because you write a hell of a note. I loved reading the notes between these women. It was just brilliant.
I really think, because this book is about a lot of deep philosophical, sometimes dark issues and moments. And I think it's so important that also running through all of that, the beating heart of this novel is friendship. And, we've all seen the camaraderie and the friendship that arises among men in combat. And so, it was really fun to be able to show this with these women who probably wouldn't have been friends in any other world, because they came from such different backgrounds. But they become, in my opinion, almost soulmates. And they are the people who are there for Frankie day in and day out and who show up. And I think there's moments in this book where the friends show up to help Frankie, and you just want to cheer at how much these three love and care for each other.
There's one moment where Frankie is probably really at the bottom and opens the door and they're both there. And you're like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, well, that's what we need right now.
Really, and I was so fortunate because last November I was able to go to Washington, D.C. for Veterans Day, with one of the women who helped advise me on this book, Diane Carlson Evans, who was a nurse in Vietnam and who founded the Women's Vietnam Memorial. And so I was, standing at the Women's Memorial, and there had to be 100 female vets standing there. To see them come together, they were hugging, they were crying, they were telling their stories, and their children were there. And it was just this amazing moment of friendship. Maybe they hadn't seen each other, in decades, and there they were together again. And it just reinforced to me the power and the presence and the endurance of these women.
The other part of that is, I think the number you use in the book at the end in the author's note, there really are no firm numbers of how many women served in Vietnam, but well over 1,000, it's believed, right?
Oh, 10,000.
10. I'm sorry, 10,000.
Yeah. And 265,000 roughly served in the services during that era, but not, in combat.
And that's an unbelievable number, because earlier in the novel, when you're talking about the Vietnam memorial, it's only a handful of women who are on that memorial.
Yeah, they really are trying to encompass all the women in these few images. And you really see when you're standing there looking at this memorial, across from the wall, you can see in the bronze faces the compassion that these women felt and showed for their patients and the price that they paid for it.
Are all male doctors snakes?
No, 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 no. But I think that was one of the things I learned from the nurses. You had to beware over there, and especially I think one of the pilots told me, we didn't wear wedding rings. I thought that was a very interesting remark.
And what is interesting also about it is that you were reminded regularly, or at least I was as I'm reading this, that, oh, right, these people are really young. These are really young people. Like
Yes.
they've lived a lifetime, but they're 20.
See, and that's what I kept thinking about with, like with Frankie. Here she is in this combat theater. She's 21 years old.
Yeah.
By the time she has served 2 tours and come home, she's 23. And the men too. I mean, all of them. It's just so amazing to think about what it is like to have that life experience at that age.
What was it like to put Frankie into that situation, into, for want of a better term, the lion's den? And I'm not talking about war. I'm just talking about dealing with the pilots and and the doctors. But being from a conservative family, of being from a very strict background, and going into that of, this is what I'm going to do to honor my family, and really to hold that set of values for as long as you possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, it was important to me. I mean, Frankie begins this novel. I mean, like I said, she goes to war out of a sense of duty and patriotism. She's been raised in a religious family, and she is a deeply moral woman. I mean, deeply moral. And then she goes off to war, and we have to remember that the Vietnam War, especially the era that she was there, the 68 kind of time period, this is the time when people were suddenly beginning to realize that their government was lying to them about the war that they were fighting and why they were there. And I think it begins to break down on so many levels. And she's in the middle of looking around and thinking to herself, how can this be the right answer? How can this be the right thing? And then discovers that she's being lied to by her government. And she is lied to, occasionally by some of the men that she meets in Vietnam.
Right.
And it's really, I think, when Frankie, at some point in the novel, when she breaks her own moral code, that is sort of the most difficult moment, more difficult than the war itself. When she makes bad decisions, that's really what causes her to fall apart.
The other thing too is, back to the letter writing, but when she's writing to her mother especially, and to her father, but she's really trying to convince them, don't believe what you're hearing, don't believe what you're reading. That's not true. This is what's true.
Right. And she, they had only the Stars and Stripes, so it was a difficult thing. And then I think, so she comes back from the war, and she is less aware than she should be of the political trauma and the protests and, the anger that is happening in the country she's coming back to as well. She really feels like, she left America in the 1950s and came back in a whole different world.
You throw a lot at this woman.
I do.
And it's amazing. And I, well, let's face it, it's realistic in the sense of what someone in that position can ultimately face. It's a lot of stuff.
It is a lot. And, I tried to do less. I tried to, I guess, make life easier for Frankie in many drafts of this novel. But I kept coming back to the memoirs of the male and female vets who had served in this war, and it just did not feel fair or right or honest, not to deal with the incredible difficulties that so many of them faced, when they came home. And it allowed me to also, sort of talk about in a fictional way something I believe very deeply, which is that if we as a country are going to ask people to go to war and serve on our behalf, we need to care for them when they come home.
It seems to me writing a novel, I don't know, but I'm assuming that writing a novel like this changes you in a fundamental way when you're talking to the families, talking to the nurses, talking to the doctors, talking to veterans, and what that does to you.
Absolutely. I mean, I've written for a long time. I've written for a lot of novels. And this one, more than anything I've ever written, it has, like you said, it has impacted and changed me. And, in talking to these veterans, especially the nurses, and in getting to know them
Mm.
and getting to know their families, I guess honored is the word, really, to be able to shine this light on their service at a time when they can read the book and they can hand the book to their children and they can have conversations, within their family and within our communities about, what they went through and what we have learned. And I just think it's so important. And this is at the end of the novel, what I have to say is recognition and thanks matter.
Kristin Hannah's new novel is The Women. It is published by St. Martin's Press. Thanks to our producer, Sarah LeDuc. Write to us at book@wamc.org. The latest on National Productions programs is available via the Airwaves newsletter at wamc.org and on social media at WAMC Radio. Bookmark us for next week, and thanks for listening for The Book Show. I'm Joe Donahue.